On large farms, when you look across a field during planting season, you usually see something very familiar. Straight rows of crops stretching across the land. Corn, soybeans, wheat. Plants growing in perfect lines, almost like someone drew long green stripes across the soil. If a farmer does his job right, every part of the field grows something. Every acre is used, because land is too valuable to waste. But on the farm I bought last year, there was one place that didn't look like the rest of the field. Right in the middle of the southern pasture, there was a patch of bare ground. Nothing grew there. No grass, no weeds, no crops. Just a wide circle of dry soil about 30 yards across. When I first saw it, I assumed it was just bad land. Every farm has places like that. Ground that's too salty, too dry, or soil that was damaged years earlier by chemicals or fertilizer. Sometimes nothing grows in those spots, no matter how much you try. So at first, I didn't think much about it. But the first strange thing happened the day I mentioned it to my neighbor. He had been farming the land next to mine for more than 30 years, so I figured he might know something about that part of the field. When I pointed toward the circle of dirt and asked him about it, he didn't answer right away. Instead, he just stood there beside the fence, staring out at the field, watching that empty patch for a long moment. Then he said something that sounded more like a warning than an explanation. "Don't plant anything there." I asked him why. He shrugged slowly. "It's not bad soil," he said. Then he looked back at me. "It's just, nothing grows there." The way he said it made it sound like the land had decided that on its own, like the soil itself had made the choice. I laughed it off at the time. Rural towns are full of stories like that. Old farmers love telling newcomers strange things about their land. So that spring, when I planted soybeans across the entire southern field, I planted them there too, right inside that circle. I figured if crops could grow there, they would, and if they couldn't, at least I would know for sure. 2 weeks later, the field began to change. Small green sprouts started pushing through the soil. Within days, the rows of soybeans spread across the land like a green carpet. Every part of the field began to fill in. Except for one place. The same empty circle still sat in the middle of the crops. Not a single plant had grown there. Not one. The dirt inside that circle looked exactly the same as it had before. Dry, flat, completely bare. Even the weeds that normally appear in every farm field stayed away from that spot. At first, I thought maybe the seeds hadn't been planted deep enough, or maybe something in the soil was preventing them from growing. But the thing that started to bother me wasn't the empty ground. It was something I noticed one night while standing in the kitchen. It was late. The house was quiet, and I happened to glance out the window toward the southern field. At first, everything looked normal. The rows of crops swaying gently in the night wind, the dark shape of the tree line far beyond the field. And in the middle of it all, that empty circle of dirt. Then I noticed something strange. The wind wasn't very strong that night. The crops around the circle were barely moving. But the soil inside that empty patch was different. It was shifting, rising slightly, then sinking again. At first, I thought my eyes were playing tricks on me. Maybe it was just shadows moving across the field. But I kept watching. And after a few seconds, the ground inside that circle rose again, then slowly fell. then rose once more. Like something underneath the soil was breathing. That night, I stood at the kitchen window longer than I meant to. At first, I tried to convince myself it was just the wind playing tricks on the soil. But the crops around that circle barely moved at all. Only the dirt inside the patch was shifting, slowly rising, then sinking again. The movement was subtle, but once you noticed it, you couldn't stop seeing it. The ground was breathing. That was the only way I could describe it. Like something beneath the surface was expanding and collapsing in slow, steady rhythm. I watched it happen 3 times before I finally grabbed a flashlight. Part of me wanted to ignore it. Farmers learn quickly that not every strange thing in the field needs to be investigated at midnight. But curiosity is a powerful thing, and the longer I stood there watching the soil rise and fall, the harder it became to look away. So I stepped outside. The night air was cool and still. The only sounds were insects in the grass and the faint rustling of crops moving in the breeze. From the porch, the empty circle didn't look unusual, just a darker patch in the middle of the field. But I knew what I had seen. I walked down the dirt path between the rows of soybeans. The plants brushed softly against my legs as I moved deeper into the field. By the time I was halfway there, the house behind me looked small and distant. The southern field stretched out in every direction, and the empty circle was right ahead. When I got close enough, I stopped. The flashlight beam cut across the ground. The soil looked dry and cracked. Nothing moved. For a moment, I wondered if the whole thing had stopped. Maybe I had imagined it. Maybe the shadows had fooled me. Then the dirt lifted again, right in front of me. The center of the circle rose several inches. The ground pushed upward like a slow wave forming under the soil. Then it sank again. I took a step back. The flashlight trembled in my hand as the beam shook across the ground. I waited, and after a few seconds, the soil rose again, this time higher. The shape beneath the dirt looked uneven, like several things were pushing upward at once. I knelt down and pointed the flashlight closer. The surface of the soil bulged in several places, small ridges pressing upward beneath the thin layer of dirt. Then the ground settled again. The movement stopped. For a moment, the field was completely still. I held the flashlight steady, staring at the center of the circle. Then the ground rose again, but this time something else happened. A small crack appeared in the soil, just a thin line spreading across the surface. More dirt shifted, more cracks followed, and through the beam of the flashlight I saw something pale pushing against the underside of the dirt. At first I thought it was a rock. Then the shape moved. The soil split slightly as the object pressed upward. And for just a second, I saw what looked like the tip of a finger. Then the ground collapsed again. The soil settled. The crack closed, and the field became silent once more. I stood there for a long time after that, the flashlight beam slowly moving across the empty circle. Nothing else moved. Nothing else pushed up from beneath the soil. Eventually, I turned around and walked back toward the house. But before I reached the porch, I looked back across the field one last time. And in the faint moonlight,
I noticed something I hadn't seen before. Small, raised shapes beneath the dirt. Dozens of them, spread across the entire circle, each one about the size of a hand, and each one slowly rising and falling with the same slow rhythm.
I didn't sleep much that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I kept seeing that patch of soil rising in the dark, and the shape beneath it. That finger pushing against the dirt. By the time the sun came up, I was already awake. The southern field looked calm again in daylight. The rows of soybeans stretched across the land, bright green in the morning light. And in the middle of it all, the empty circle of soil. From the porch it looked harmless, just a strange patch of dirt where nothing grew. But I knew what I had seen the night before. So after breakfast, I grabbed a shovel. Farmers dig holes all the time, for irrigation lines, for fence posts, for drainage. Digging into the soil shouldn't have felt strange. But as I walked toward that empty circle, something about the field felt different. Too quiet. Even the insects seemed to stay away from that spot. When I stepped onto the bare soil, the ground felt slightly softer than the rest of the field. Not wet, just loose, like it had been turned recently. I drove the shovel into the dirt. The blade slid in easily, too easily. The soil wasn't packed the way farmland usually is. It felt like digging into something that had already been disturbed before. I lifted the first scoop of dirt and tossed it aside. Nothing unusual, just dark soil. I dug again, and again. Each time the shovel sank deeper with almost no resistance. After a few minutes, the hole was about a foot deep. Still nothing. No rocks, no roots, no buried debris. Just more loose soil. But the deeper I dug, the stranger the ground felt. The dirt was warmer than it should have been. Not hot, just warmer than the surrounding soil. I paused for a moment and pressed my hand against the bottom of the hole. The warmth was real, like the ground beneath the field had been holding heat overnight. I picked up the shovel again and pushed it deeper. The blade struck something. Not stone, not metal. Something softer. The sound was dull, a thick, muffled knock beneath the soil. I cleared more dirt away carefully. The shape beneath the ground slowly began to appear. At first, all I could see was pale color under the dirt. Then the outline became clearer. 5 narrow shapes lying side by side. My breath caught in my throat, because those shapes looked exactly like fingers. Human fingers, curled slightly beneath the soil. I froze there beside the hole, staring down at them. The dirt around the shapes shifted slightly as loose soil fell away from the sides of the hole. And then the fingers moved. Just a little, barely enough to notice, but enough that I knew I hadn't imagined it. Something was alive beneath the ground. I dropped the shovel and stumbled backward away from the hole, my eyes still fixed on the place where the dirt had collapsed. The fingers were gone again. The soil had fallen back over the hole, like the ground itself was trying to close. I stood there, shaking for several seconds, trying to decide what I had just seen, trying to convince myself it wasn't real. But deep down, I knew something under that field was still there, waiting beneath the soil. And slowly, very slowly, it was trying to come back up. I stood there for a long time staring at the hole. The dirt had partially collapsed back in, covering whatever I had just seen. For a few seconds, the field was completely silent. No movement, no sound. Just the warm morning air moving across the crops. I told myself it had to be something else. A buried animal, but trick of the light. Maybe a root that only looked like fingers. But deep down, I already knew that wasn't true. Roots don't move. And roots don't feel warm. I forced myself to step closer again. The hole was shallow now, half filled by the dirt that had slid back inside. I grabbed the shovel and carefully pushed the loose soil aside. The blade scraped gently against something underneath. That same dull sound again. Soft, heavy. I cleared more dirt away, slowly. The pale shapes appeared again beneath the soil. This time, there was no mistaking it. 5 fingers. A human hand, buried just beneath the surface. The skin was gray and covered in dirt, but the shape was unmistakable. The hand was angled upward, as if whoever it belonged to had tried to push toward the surface. I took another step back. My mind raced through possibilities. Old graves, accidents, things farmers sometimes find buried in rural land. But the deeper I looked into the hole, the more wrong everything felt. The skin didn't look decayed. It didn't look like something that had been buried for years. It looked fresh. The fingers twitched again. Just a small movement, but enough to make my stomach turn. Then the soil around the hand shifted. More dirt slid downward into the hole, and something else beneath the ground moved with it. Not just the hand. Something larger. Something attached to it. I dropped the shovel and backed away again. The dirt inside the hole began to move slowly, rising and falling. The same slow rhythm I had seen the night before. The ground was breathing again, but this time I could see why. The movement wasn't coming from one place. It was happening all across the circle. Small bulges in the dirt rising and falling together, like dozens of shapes were pressing upward beneath the soil. Hands. The realization hit me all at once. Not just one hand. There were many of them, all buried beneath the empty circle, all pushing upward from below. The soil shifted again near the hole I had dug. For a moment, the dirt cracked open wider, and through the opening, I saw something else. Not just fingers. A face, half covered in soil. Eyes closed, skin pale beneath the dirt. Then the earth shifted again. The hole collapsed inward. The face disappeared beneath the soil once more. The ground settled slowly. The circle of dirt became still again, like nothing had happened. But I could still feel the warmth coming from the soil beneath my boots. And as I stood there staring at that patch of land, I began to understand something terrible. The reason nothing grew in that circle of dirt was because something else was already growing there. Something beneath the ground. Something alive. And whatever it was slowly trying to come up. I didn't go back to the field for the rest of that day. I stayed inside the house, watching the southern pasture through the kitchen window. From a distance, the circle looked exactly the same as it always had. A quiet patch of bare soil in the middle of the crops. Nothing moved. Nothing broke through the surface. If I hadn't seen what happened with my own eyes, I might have convinced myself none of it was real. But the shovel was still lying out there, half buried in the dirt where I had dropped it. And every time I looked at that patch of land, I remembered the hand pushing through the soil, the warmth of the ground, the face beneath the dirt. That night, the wind picked up across the field. I stood on the porch again, staring toward the empty circle. For a long time, nothing happened. The crops swayed gently. The clouds drifted slowly across the sky. Then the soil moved again. The center of the circle rose slightly, then sank, then rose again. The same slow rhythm as the night before. Breathing. But this time the movement spread farther across the circle. Small sections of soil lifted and fell in different places, like dozens of shapes were shifting beneath the ground. I grabbed a pair of binoculars from inside the house and looked toward the field. The moonlight was just bright enough to see the surface of the dirt, and what I saw made my stomach drop. Thin cracks were forming across the soil, long lines spreading slowly through the circle. Then the dirt broke apart in one small spot near the center. Something pale pushed upward. At first it was only a few fingers. Then another hand appeared several feet away. Then another. One after another, pale shapes pressed through the dirt. Hands reaching upward through the soil. Some of them barely moving. Others slowly clawing at the ground above them. I lowered the binoculars and just stared across the field. The wind moved through the crops. The soil inside the circle continued to rise and fall, and the hands slowly sank back beneath the surface. The cracks closed. The dirt settled again. Within minutes, the field looked quiet. Still. Almost normal. The next morning, I walked out to the circle again. The ground looked undisturbed. No open holes, no hands, no broken soil. Just the same empty patch of dirt in the middle of the field. But when I stood there long enough, I began to notice something. The soil wasn't completely flat. Small raised shapes pressed gently against the surface, barely visible, but there were many of them, more than I could count. I knelt down and placed my hand against the ground. The warmth was still there, and beneath the soil, I could feel movement. Very slow, very faint. Like dozens of fingers, pushing upward from below. That was when I finally understood why nothing ever grew in that spot. The land wasn't empty. It was already full. And whatever was buried beneath that field was still trying to come back up.